Well, thanks, Bob. That's very nice. Well, it's great to be here, and I'm delighted to see you all, and I'll try and dash through a few things, and we'll see. Let's see, if I dim the lights, I hope you don't mind. I'll just try this one and see what happens. Not much. Oh, there we go. I was going to do a title with green or blue, but I realized I was at USC, so I tried to remember. My memory is this: these are about the right colors. Sense of where you are, so to speak. A city is a landscape. Let's think about that. Most of us commonly think, I'm going to stop right here. I'm going to take off this jacket like most of you, because it is warm, isn't it? Thank you. Most of us commonly think of the nature of... I'm just going to fiddle around for a second. I'll stop. One more try. Take 3. I think most of us, we usually think that of nature and cities as being some kind of opposites, almost polar opposites, a pair of phenomena in opposition. We think of them as separate from each other somehow, an antinomy, so to speak. But even so, for thousands of years, we've been bringing natural things, rural elements into our cities. We've been making gardens in which we sit, stroll. We want to put our hands in the earth. We make gardens to attract birds, to make enclaves that are very lush, plants, water, all that. And these are two examples. One on your, left is first century Rome. It's a painting of a garden from a garden. It's sort of odd, painted a garden in a garden, but why not? And the one on the right is just a residence we did a few years ago in San Francisco. And they're almost the same exact stuff. Now, most of you everybody in the room has probably had enough architecture history and history of urbanism to know that a lot of ancient cities were created by agricultural societies. Not only did they have natural features as part of their setting and their very fabric, but they also were conceived and built with ideas of the sacredness of the earth, and that there was a dependency in the relationship of people on the processes and the bounty of the earth. Whether it's in Mexico, as you see, or in ancient China. One of the things is these aspects, compositions of cities, partook of nature itself and of the concept of sacredness. And as you also remember, with the rise of secular power, the evolution of trade and industry and technology that transformed society and cities, this led to their physical appearance changing around the world, being less about being sacred diagrams. They began to have the agriculture further and further away. But even so, they never really banished the underlying geology or the climate or the physical presence of nature. Our cities have only masked or distracted us from its presence. And as cities grew, first geometrically and later exponentially, an antidote to some of their problems, especially those of health and mental well-being of workers and residents, that were crowded into the new cities that were developing. As an antidote, urban parks and public gardens were developed, and they proliferated for the past 150 years. And these two famous examples you must recognize as Central and Prospect Parks in New York City. They were designed by Olmsted after the Civil War, and they formed the basis for parks that were copied around the country and around the world for generations. Well, nevertheless, I think we could say that despite the international parks movement of the last century, of the 19th and 20th century, cities have continued to grow and at an extraordinary rate. And millions of people flee them each year to suburbs because they find the cities themselves to be crowded and dirty or frightening, and they flee to a kind of a little bit of the natural world. They move out thinking they'll get to something better and prettier, and where there might be a better climate, a nicer place for their kids or something like that. And they want to go to some place they think is more habitable than these cities. That's San Francisco, which most people think is very habitable. But look at its suburbs. Well, like a lot of people in this room, in fact almost everybody in this room, I guess, I wandered into design not particularly thinking about any of those things. I began drawing and looking around very long and hard in the world about me when I was a kid in Alaska. where I had the enormous, great fortune to grow up in one of the greatest landscapes in the world. One where nature is absolutely omnipresent, and it's powerful, it's subtle, and it's very beautiful. But I came out to the States, like some of my friends and colleagues and peers, as we would say. I came out to the States, and I studied architecture, you just heard, at the University of Washington, and then I apprenticed in what were superb offices of the day in Seattle and in New York City. And it was very exciting for me. And, I learned an enormous amount working as a young architect. Not just about how to conceive and make buildings thoughtfully, but also in coming out to the States, I fell in love with cities. Wow. I was supposed to be learning about how to make buildings, and I couldn't separate them from the cities I was in. And even so, when I was working at Edward Larrabee Barnes' office in New York in the 1960s, you see me there in a picture with all these comparative campus plans behind me drawn to scale. Well, like many people who were troubled by the times in the mid to late 60s, by the wars, the social upheavals, the urban and environmental crises that were emerging, I dropped out. I left architecture and took a couple of years off to think about things and what I should do with my energy and my interests. I moved back to the Pacific Northwest, and I lived on an island, and I studied the world around me very carefully, more carefully than I ever had as a child just wandering about in it. And I was working in various media, and I was starving. I studied the rocks, the plants, the water. Having a great life, but I was very poor. And I was really looking at, the world I was in, and with great interest I began reading a lot of the ecological writing that was beginning to appear in the late 60s, both in the popular and in the scientific press. But at the same time, I also became involved in urban politics, having taken a studio on Skid Road in downtown Seattle in the old Globe Hotel. And I became involved as the vice president of Friends of the Market in a struggle to save the historic Pike Place Market. That's my teacher, Victor Steinbrook, and a lot of members of Allied Arts and architects and designers in the city. And we also began trying to push to save older parts of the historic parts of the city. And this led me to both live with and to, excuse me, I didn't want to do that. I was going to do something else. I began not only looking in the city, but I began living with the Skid Road community, and I began to study them, and I decided to publish a small anti-planning tract about the Skid Row community that looked at the city in terms of human ecology and ethnography. I didn't know what ethnography was, but that's what I was doing, I discovered later. My perception of what that city was radically different from that of both the middle class and the city government and its planners at the time. I'd come to realize that cities were not particularly an architectural problem, at least not as architecture was construed in those days. I discovered something that Claude Lévi-Strauss had noted as early as 1939, when he wrote that cities were cultural landscapes. I came to see them as vast and complex landscape design problems. Admittedly, they are full of buildings. But a mere collection of buildings, even famous ones by hotshot designers, doesn't guarantee a successful or attractive or healthy place to live, a nice place to work, or fall in love, or have families, or to become old. Consider Dallas. Just collecting buildings doesn't make a real city. It doesn't make a great city. In fact, wrong thing. In fact, some of the greatest places, some of the greatest cities, I believe, consist largely of fairly ordinary background and, at times, even dull buildings. Consider Paris. Consider London. Rows and rows, miles of fairly ordinary facades of a kind of ordinary, civil, numbing sort. But great cities for other reasons, because other factors actually come into play about those great cities. I came to the numbing realization that we are part of nature, that we're in nature all the time. We're never not in nature. We're in nature so much that we don't even know it. As Ian McHarg once said, the fish will be the last creature to discover water. One of the things is that in cities, we're in nature as much as the Haida Indians who lived here in this drawing of mine, and Tongass Narrows. We just don't see it. We don't act upon it. But it's there, and we're in it. At several scales, cities, I have realized, behave like natural systems. And the principles that have been noted operating in nature, especially complex regions, whether inhabited or not, can be seen in cities as well. A very brief summary of these, based upon the writings of Richard Foreman, whose marvelous, simple and clear studies of landscape ecology I recommend to any and all of you. One of the things he says is that living systems exhibit three broad characteristics: structure, functioning, and change. Now, landscape structure is the spatial pattern or the arrangement of landscape elements, right? Functioning is the flow or movement of animals, plants, water, wind, materials, energy, and in cities you could add people, money, goods, ideas. These are the things that flow through the structure. Change, in his terms for this, is the dynamics of the alteration in spatial pattern and functioning over time. The structural patterning of landscape is composed entirely of three types of universal elements, period. Everything falls into these categories at some scale. Patches, corridors, and matrices. Or you can say matrices if you studied Latin, as some of us did. So, there we have it. Landscapes are composed of basically a few basic elements, and those types are, shall we say, patches, corridors, and matrices. Now, patches can be very big or very small, varying in their shape, or they can be few or many. Corridors can be straight or curvy, they can be narrow or broad. And a matrix is what we'll call an extensive or interconnected similar association of some sort of fabric, a community, or of a material. Now, these are all scaleless concepts. These are not size determinate. They operate at almost any scale. And here, for instance, in this slide from the Summer Palace in northwestern Beijing, we could say this building, you could describe almost as a patch within a matrix of the trees, right? There's this big continuum of trees that you'd say is a forest, and there's this temple of sorts. But when you step back another level and look out, you suddenly realize at another scale that the park and the lake and the temple that we were just looking at can also be seen as a patch within the enormous matrix of the sprawling city that's come to surround it, right? So there are these sort of scale shifts here, but seeing something as an island or patch versus seeing it as something else. That's pretty important in understanding something about landscape ecology, and I think in looking at cities. Now, we're familiar, I think you and I are familiar, and we're all very comfortable with the idea that nature and its processes are dynamic and not static. We expect forest fires, floods, trees to fall down, animals to move around. But we're less so comfortable in our views about our urban environment. We can see the patterns, the juxtapositions, the interactions, and the events in the natural world, but we have a harder time seeing them about ourselves and about our own works. Thanks to the fractals and 20th century mathematics, we can see that many events and processes are not scale dependent. And some are very much are. For instance, why aren't ants as large? Why can't they become as big as Godzilla? You know, Darcy Thompson, a bunch of people almost a century and a half ago began to figure out why, because there were certain aspects of their structure that were dependent upon physics and certain mathematics, and so they were size dependent. But there are other events, dynamics, and that the mathematics of flow, for instance, can describe, such as the smoke from the end of a cigarette or the eddy in a river, in the current of a river, or a Hurricane Katrina, that are almost identical, that are very similar, and that are not size dependent. They're the same. And such things can be said about urban landscapes, I believe. Some things seem very much size dependent, and some things aren't at all. It's your job and my job to learn what the differences are and which ones are which. I'm not going to give you a list because I'm working in the middle of it. But these are important things to think about. Well, for several reasons, after this dropping out and wandering around and doing various things, I returned to design a couple of times. But finally, I settled back into something that we all call landscape design, landscape architecture, but particularly that of the landscape of cities, working largely on public, private, institutional, civic, and commercial development. And while I suppose I could have ended up in regional planning or city planning or something, I was actually more interested in making things in places. I also saw that even though I believed cities were landscapes, I realized no one person, no one group, no profession, no agency could or probably should be able to design, plan, or control them entirely. It's impossible. Cities are built, they're changed, they're added to, they're transformed in pieces and in fragments and in districts and in chunks. Basically in the elements that Richard Foreman, an ecologist, said that landscapes were composed of. This project that's on the screen right now of ours in London, where we worked with many architects and engineers off and on for about 15 years, is Canary Wharf, the largest commercial project in European history. It's a large chunk. The first phase was 4 million square feet. There have been many more phases to this since, but it's a chunk nonetheless. It's a large chunk, but it's a chunk. It's not a city. It's just a piece. It's a district. There are many buildings in Canary Wharf, but there's only one landscape, although it has several distinct places within. This, I think, is an important thing to understand. Another such project, which was unique and somewhat new at the time, quite a while ago now, Battery Park City in New York, seems fairly common today. Nearly every large city in the world that you know, I know, has former industrial areas that are abandoned. There's transportation areas that are redundant. There's old military facilities. And many of these, what have come to be called brownfield sites, or redundant industrial sites, many of these are near the very heart of the polis. They're near the centers of these metropolitan regions. These sites are de facto districts or enclaves, and quite often they have great difficulties in connectivity to the rest because they were built as enclaves for particular reasons. Now, in the case of this project, which we worked on in several campaigns since 1979, oops, I keep hitting the wrong thing when I want to do something else. We attempted to continue the fabric of the city, the general matrix of Wall Street, the Wall Street district, while we're setting out a framework of parks, of streets, and of open spaces. It's pretty normative, you would say, and certainly many people have criticized it for being so old hat, but 94 acres of what it would today be illegal landfill in the Hudson River that was sitting there for 20 years abandoned, to come up with a plan that could actually get built was an achievement. And that big chunk, although the streets are 1% of the total area, buildings cover a lot, the actual open space, the so-called, I hate the phrase open space, but we all use it. But it's not just the landscape, because the buildings are part of the landscape. So we'll call it the open space, is actually small physically in comparison to the bulk and mass of the accretion of buildings. This little fringe along the water is actually analogous to a shoreline or a beach with fingers of green that lead back into the cracks in the sea, kind of like the streams and the cliffs of the Palisades a few miles up the Hudson River. Well, that skinny little strip has become heavily used. In those little areas, it becomes some extraordinarily popular places for people to step out of the city into the space of that big space of the Hudson River, to look around and to take the air and the sun and the light, to feel the wind and get some exercise on this mile-long esplanade and greenway that we invented that had never existed before in the city of New York. There really aren't many landmark or superb buildings in the entire development, and to everyone's dismay, despite the reputable firms that work there, and yet it has become a distinctly successful part of the city of New York. It's a popular place to live, to work, to recreate, and it has acted as a catalyst to encourage the city of New York to subsequently reclaim the entire rest of the edge of Manhattan shoreline with esplanades and new parks, and now move on and do so in the borough of Brooklyn as well. So it was an interesting project to do as the experiment it was. Here's another large portion of a city, Mission Bay in San Francisco. Again, a large number of professional firms worked here over many years with the developer, with government officials, and an extensive community process. And collectively, we prepared a plan that's gradually, painfully being implemented over a series of economic cycles. It's a classic example of normative design in terms of street, blocks, transport, and utilities. It's also a very clear presentation of the principal features of a landscape, namely patches, garters, and matrix. As in the design of mixed landscape where one wants to facilitate habitat for animals, there is connectivity, there's a maximization of edges onto open space, in this case China Basin and the San Francisco Bay, as well as spatial linkages between various parts of the overall landscape that can be used by the people in the buildings adjacent to them and that also provide various avenues of movement. It's just very much like looking at wildlife corridors. The pieces that look fairly ordinary, the stuff that's getting built, is kind of good of their kind. Development, spec office buildings, residential buildings for the commercial market. The landscape is immature. It's less than adolescent. It's been designed by several hands, but I believe if any of us come back in 20 years, this is going to be a dense, vibrant, bustling place in which to live, work, and play. And by then, maybe it will have gotten some really interesting architecture, some great buildings. Or maybe one really superb, beautiful garden or park. But right now, the basic structure, it's happening, and it's working pretty well. So, different people can have different approaches, especially as the look, or if you prefer, style or appearance of forms, regarding how one might want to organize and achieve large urban districts, such as the ones I've just been showing. But the activities and elements are really basically pretty common. Another particular interest of mine has been that comes out of looking at cities and their traditions and thinking about them as landscapes is the notion of the hanging garden. It is actually quite a tradition. Whether you start in Babylon or go up through, Halpern and Seattle with some of the work across the freeway. The notion of directly importing elements of natural and rural landscapes and incorporating them right into the urban fabric, of basically using buildings and structures of architecture and infrastructure as ground or as topography, using something like a parking garage or a building or a deck over a freeway as if it's a site. That interests me. Now, this example you see on the screen, strangely enough, we actually built downtown here behind Union Station at a transit plaza where I had a simple notion that one way to solve the handicap ramp is to do a ravine, right? Just rip a hole in the garage and tip some down and pour trees in it. And you would solve that problem and make a pretty interesting place. You can take a look at it. It's waiting painfully for some buildings to come around it, but that's another story. Now, a better example of this idea is a project that we did not too long ago in Salt Lake City for the Mormon Church, who had hired the architectural firm ZGF from Portland, Oregon, to create an assembly building for them that would seat between 20,000 and 30,000 people for an annual conference. They have semi-annual conferences. Twice a year, about 30,000 people descend on Salt Lake from around the world. These are sort of pilgrimages of a sort to their mother church. And the site they picked was opposite the historic temple and tabernacle, which you see in the slide on your left. And the slide on the far right, and you can see the open space network such as it was in the city of Salt Lake in the middle with City Creek up in that upper right-hand corner, and then it comes down to the big blobs of green. Is there a pointer around? No. Forgot to do pointers, but you can. There might be one. But anyway, one of the things is Temple Square, which you see in the other slide, is sort of in the upper bit there. And then the slide on the far right shows you Temple Square at the bottom, and then the upper square shows this huge square with this big funny piece of pine in it. That's the size that they felt this conference center was going to be. It was gigantic. In fact, this is the size of the hall that emerged from the design. In order to seat all these people in one room, it's a big building. It's more people than go to the Utah Jazz games, right? Okay. So, which is down the street, and they didn't want it to feel like a basketball arena. They wanted to feel, like something much more ecclesiastical, I presume. Well, here you can see some sketches that we did very early on. I told Bob Praska, the lead designer from Portland, I said, Bob, you can't think of this as, you shouldn't think of this in terms of a building. And he kind of looked at me, because it's a weird thing to say to your friend who's an architect who's about to build one of the biggest buildings he's ever had a chance to do. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, if you did a kind of dome over it or something, it would be so big, it would dwarf the tabernacle and the temple, and it looked like the mothership that had come to eat all the people or something like that. And I said, so, I think you have to think of this in terms of the landscape of Utah and southern Utah, maybe like a mesa or a plateau, and with this active in the front facades or faces, but is a landscape above. And he said, you mean put a garden or park on top? I said, yeah. And he said, well, okay, we'll just work on it. So the sketch on the right is a sketch he did after I'd done the sketches on the left, saying, it could be kind of like maybe some of this stuff, and it got a little bit, literal. But then he said, well, he's got to figure out how to break down the big form because it was just too lumpy and too huge. So we began looking at things to do with it, and rather than do rows of flowers and the kind of planting that they had at Temple Square, I began looking up in the Wasatch Mountains and looking in the region and looking at the meadows, looking at the ravines, the vegetation, the ecology with my partner, Sue Weiler, and she and I began thinking we can do something else here. And of course we did. This is the roof of the building. The building occupies 6 acres. The roof is 6 acres. 4 acres of it are an alpine meadow with groves of trees. This is what's underneath that roof. It's a room that seats 25,000 people. Perfect air conditioning, much nicer than this room. Perfect acoustics for the Mormon Tabernacle Choir and their organ and all that. But what's up top of this, right above that ceiling with those lights you see there, is that. It's a place that now apparently has been invaded by rabbits and field mice. There are hawks have been seen hunting here, and it has all these native plants that we grew. Right in downtown Salt Lake City. You can see to Antelope Island and the Great Salt Lake from it, and it's a fabulous place to be. It's big. There's lots of people come, as I said. And we had to design it to handle the population when they came. Suddenly there's these floods of people. And then it had to look pretty good when it was empty. And it's derived, of course, from looking at the place, the region, and using the native plants from the region in this other way. And it evokes the place. It's not natural. It's not fake nature. It's not pretend something. It's an abstraction of the place it's derived from, and it speaks to where you are. On North Temple Street, we also realized that City Creek had been put in the pipe, and although it still would flood if we brought the whole thing out, we said, can we have a little of it? We're not going to, quote, daylight the stream because we'd flood the city. They'd put it in a pipe for a reason. But on the other hand, I wanted to show that there was a reason why they were there to start with. It's because there was water, and it came right down the street, and they were right next to it. So we basically redesigned the curb to put a stream, pieces of City Creek flowing in it that we took from underneath the street. So I firmly believe one can do these things. Now, when we began working on a campus plan for MIT, about the same time, at the same time we began doing a campus plan for MIT, which looks pretty dull and ordinary, like, streets and buildings and green blobs in this drawing. The university had also hired several architects to do particular projects there. They'd hired Frank Gehry, Stephen Hall, Fumihiko Maki, Charles Correa, Morwu Udell, a series of people. And they'd started us all at the same time. Now, this would really drive some of my colleagues nuts. It's very nonlinear. The idea that you don't do it, shouldn't you do a plan first, and then you go hire the people, and then they do all the parts, and they're supposed to fill in blanks. But this was actually much more like a natural process. Only MIT would be nutty enough to do this, I think. And that is to say, well, why can't you all interact? And so what happened was, it was very good. It didn't faze any of the people as far as I could tell. Some people wanted to collaborate more than others in that crowd I just listed. Didn't faze us. The notion that this is the way things happen in nature. Multiple forces interact in various portions of space. Their exchanges, feedbacks, adaptations, patterns, and structures emerge. And so we began to interact with each of the architects, as I said, to various degrees, partly as a result of their sense and their interest in collaboration, and partly that of their client group, some of which were much more open to ideas and innovation than others. Some engineers are extraordinarily conservative, I discovered, and others are quite curious and open, just like the rest of society. So the most interesting and rewarding of these collaborations for us, which is not a surprise because we'd worked with him before, was Frank Gehry. He and his partner Mark Salat and their team on the Stata Computer Science Center were a lot of fun, and we kind of bent our plan to accommodate them, and then we took some stuff from that and pushed it back into the plan, and then we pushed back at the building and everything. And together we turned a large portion of the building into the only hill at MIT, which largely sits in the site of a late 19th century landfill in the Charles River estuary. And we treated the building and the site as an absolute continuum. The paths from outside go inside, the paths from outside go up and over the building, they go into the building. It's all slightly intertwined. This is a sketch I did at one point where you can see that I'm just pulling landscape up and through and incorporating pieces of things. Because one of the clients are wonderful. Oh, God, you need good clients, people you talk to. One of them, one of the scientists who we were working with was a man named Michael Dituzis. If you couldn't guess, he is Greek. And the notion that we were going to take a piece of the side of their building that had a big lecture hall and a blank wall and turn it into an amphitheater as part of our hill, he thought, cool. And then when I said, but we have to have trees, and he said, of course, all great ruined amphitheaters have trees in them. And so the notion that Michael got his trees in his amphitheater. Unfortunately, he is not with us anymore. He died, but he was a great client. And so here's our site plan of this project. And you can see there's a lot of Frank's efforts in it, and there's a lot of our efforts, and they're totally interchanged. This is phase one. We never get to do phase two. But the client loves that project, and they're very happy in it as far as I can tell. It suits them. It wouldn't suit other people. But in the course of doing it, we began working with our engineers saying, we got a water problem. The MIT's in the way. All the water from Cambridge is trying to get through to the Charles River, but the Charles River is already full. So, and they get, about an even amount of, 4 or 5 inches of rain every month, which is a lot of rain over the year, millions of gallons. So the question was, couldn't we catch all the rain and do something with it? So we said yes, but I couldn't find any place to have a surface expression of a pond because we were out of space in the middle of the campus. So we concluded with our engineers that what we do is we do a basin below grade and stack the water up. We would catch all the water from all the roofs of the buildings and from the site. We would run it into this basin, which is the lower blue blob. Then we put some solar panels up on the roof, and we'd run a little pump and some pumps, and we would use that as the water to flush all the toilets in the building. So we've got about a week's worth of toilet flushes at any one time here, and we've been using it for 2.5 years now with no problems. We would also use some of that water with another little pump, and we would recirculate it, and we would run it back over the land above the basin through some planting we would do and scrub the water with the planting, but we would put riparian plants that like to be wet. And so we would use some riparian plants to clean the water that we're putting back in the basin. So it was very simple, and we would use the sun to do that for us. And then we'd have a little extra freeboard for when we get the 25, 50-year storms. We'd have more rainwater we could hold, and then we would release that slowly to the Charles. All of MIT has to pump it into the Charles because most of MIT is below the Charles River. So that we couldn't help. We couldn't get gravity to the Charles that we normally would have. Here's a picture of several of the steps. There's the hole we dug. The way we lined it, we stacked up these funny little plastic gizmos that take a very small percentage of the volume, but held up when we put the top on with the sands and gravels for the plants and came back and I said, this is a glaciated landscape. Boston is a really interesting place with all these esters and terminal moraine and all this junk. I would really like to have this be something like, to at least remind people of the landscape that was around. And so we went and got ourselves some boulders, and we did a boulder field, which there are many of around Boston. We put that on top of our basin, which tells you how strong all those little plastic gizmos are. They're really strong. That stuff you did in basic design with toothpicks really works. And so here we are building the boulder field and this riparian planting on top of our basin, which is part of the mechanical system in the building. It's also part of our stormwater management system. And so we produced this little thing that wanders through this portion of the campus. And there it is. It doesn't look like a traditional campus quad, I admit, but they have so much flatness, so much kind of boring lawn that doesn't do well in the snow for the whole period. In Boston, this stuff looks much better in the snow than most of the quads at MIT. I would say that these boulders and plants remind anybody who notices that they're in a landscape heavily affected by glaciers, that their deposition and the rigors of the region are all around them. It's also, I think, a welcome contrast to the struggling lawns. So, which, as I said, spend part of the year under snow and ice and are wastefully irrigated. Okay, so the hill got built. People use it. And interesting enough, there are pieces of this landscape where I would find faculty members, students sitting up on top, over on the side, next to a boulder. It's kind of like they've stepped out of the campus. They are out of town. These people are away somewhere doing their work. So it was a place that works for crowds. It works for the individual. It works for the environment. Very interesting set of goals. A current project that our office is working on right now that combines the activities of district planning with open space corridors, patches, and landscape over structures, it's intertwined with buildings, creating a diverse environment, lively social life day and night is the somewhat controversial project that we're currently working on with Frank Gehry's office, the Brooklyn Atlantic Yards development, which places a professional basketball arena, offices, a hotel, 6,000 units of residential structures over a rail yard of the Long Island Railroad and the intersection of 6 subway lines. And this project is also going to close an open gash that has separated the Fort Greene neighborhood from that of Park Slope and Prospect Park neighborhoods for over a century. It's built at the intersection of Flatbush and Atlantic Avenues, and it's going to change Brooklyn forever. Something that is very upsetting to many people, but I think is a normal, positive event in the life and the history of a city. These kind of changes come along and the place is different. You turn the dials up, more people are there, more is going on. It's environmentally very interesting what's going on. And, we're going to do the usual. Catch all the water, reuse the water, make a place with lots of places, different places for people, have some recreation, pull the outside into the inside, take the upstairs down to the subway. That's our kind of job. And then I'm very interested in nighttime as well as daytime. Because in cities, so that's our beginning to figure out what that new public space at those intersections is going to be like and how it might be lit at night and the kind of action that it might get. Because our owner has bought the New Jersey Nets and is moving them here in 2 years. And we're all on a fairly tight time schedule to do this, as you can imagine. Oh, that's a leftover, excuse me. Now, I don't want to act like we're so special that my firm or my field, that we're the only people to understand the integrated nature of landscape structure and what it might do in urban development. Here's a very odd little example of that, for instance. Constantine Brancusi, the great Romanian sculptor, created his only outdoor monumental sculpture in the town of Târgu in western Romania. It's a 4-hour drive from Bucharest. It's a memorial to the fallen heroes of Târgu from World War I, where a series of bright, nice young schoolboys and old men fought the Germans and were all killed, but basically saved the day. And what Brancusi did was to produce a series of elements that were distributed in a sequence through the town, from the riverside where the battle had occurred through a Victorian park. He put some things through the park. And then he appropriated a somewhat historic church, which you see in the middle of that lower drawing, in what was then the edge of town. And he placed the last piece, the colonne sans fin, the endless column, on a hill outside of town in what at the time was a haymarket. Now this kind of stunning set of profoundly abstract and atavistic pieces, we'll see in a minute, produced a cohesion in the spiritual axis, so to speak, that had transformed this small country town into into a place of national and international cultural importance. It also gave the people in the town in that region a very strong self-identity and a sense of community and purpose and history and commonality. And so we learned a lot about it, and needless to say, we had to learn tons about it, when we were asked by the World Monument Fund to help rescue it from the mess that the communist regime had left it in when Ceausescu was eliminated. One of the things that happened was many people realized that sculptures had been deteriorating, so they mounted a restoration of some of the pieces. They realized that just repairing the pieces of sculpture was not enough, that the setting had been completely lost, and there's more than one way to kill great works of art, one of which is to destroy their setting or their situation. Well, this is the Avenue of Heroes with its sequence of stools, and I cannot explain to you why that grass looks so terrible. It's a computer digital image that something went wrong. So excuse me. The grass really is normal. It's not this kind of day-glow green. This is the Avenue of Heroes, and it has a sequence of stools which lead from the Table of Silence at the river. And you couldn't even see the sculpture, let alone feel it. I mean, the setting had totally swallowed it, and the setting was hideous. Well, we ripped it all out. We redid the path in a kind of delicious crushed stone from the region, and while we were producing a new kind of woodland edge to separate this ceremonial promenade from the kind of park, the rides and the distractions of the park that were socially useful around, but totally destroyed this monument. We figured out how to, the color's a little better here, we figured out how to, working with our lighting designer, Hervé Scots, how to illuminate it at night so one actually could see the progression from the Table of Silence to the Avenue of the Heroes with the stools to the Gate of the Kiss, which we'll see in a minute, and how to make it a place that really felt like a cultural monument and a great piece of history. And then we had to clear up the mess around the Gate of the Kiss so you could actually see it and have it seem as important as it really is, and to be as important as it is, and to give it its dignity back. Finally, of course, we proposed unifying them with simple planting of trees through the city, which is yet to come. And then we had to clear up the mess up at the top with the endless column. And we had to sort of get back so that it was like stepping out of the city, and you could see it again. this most profound, the most abstract, the first great abstract modern monumental sculpture in the world. And there it is in this part of Romania. And it's absolutely sublime. And we have to, again, make things go away and then thereby pull the town back together. And so, landscape architects are the only people who get ideas about how something might have an overall construction and pattern that would do something for a community. Now, many designers make some funny weird things happen to you. The year of that was the year we got the Washington Monument Project and also this Columbus Circle. And 3 obelisks in 1 year, and I thought, what's going on? This is too bizarre. But anyway, many designers make the mistake of trying to make everything be important. I've done it. You may do it at some point. A lot of designers try to make everything special. Every work is a masterpiece, which is actually worse than foolish. A lot of the world really should be ordinary. It should be background or support for other action and other activities so that when you do find something that's important, you can really make it be special. If everything's special, nothing's special. That's so obvious. But, highway engineers and landscape architects made the mistake that so many building architects make of trying to make everything say, look at me, and startle and amaze you, it's going to fall on you or something. We'd all be driving off the road all the time, and falling down, bumping into things. So, in any landscape, however, as in a city, some places are more important than others. And they deserve more attention. Some buildings should be monuments. Some buildings should never be monuments. But some of these landscape places, they are often locations where several things meet. Columbus Circle in New York is just such a place. Although it was once a handsome, city, beautiful monument in a swirl of traffic with these nice old trolleys running around it, it once was, pretty good. It's at the southwest corner of Central Park, and it was one of the great entries into Central Park, as you see. It had descended into a complete mess as a result of bad traffic planning and changes to the park that happened under late Moses' era. It was all screwed up. In 1985, we conducted a feasibility study with Central Park Conservancy to reorganize and redesign the entire circle. This is not the how to change it. This is what had happened to it. This is the before. And we were asked to reorganize and redesign the entire circle, and make it work better, and to be more handsome, and to make it be the civic space it wanted to be. And you can see what the traffic folks had done to render this 5-way intersection absolutely incomprehensible. It was a mess. And finally, the way to keep traffic from getting too confused, they filled it with parking and motorcycles and things like that. So and then they also had produced this crabbed entrance into the park at the main monument, the monument to the blowing up of the main battleship in Havana Harbor, which has its own story. Anyway, well, the scheme that Bob Hanna and I did was bold. It was very simple. We said, make it a circle. Respect the inherent symmetry of the monuments, create more generous island in the center, and add trees and good paving, and then stop. We said, do that. Do that, don't do more. But do that. Well, actually, after you fast forward 16 years, that was 1985, time is different for landscape architects, I think, than for other people. After a lot of false starts, other designs by other people, competitions, and building portions of the main monument scheme as we suggested by someone else, the track had finally been returned to a working circle, and we were asked to come back in the last days of the Giuliani administration to redo or finish the center. And in the interim, we had learned a thing or two about a lot of things, and one of them was we took a look and we decided the water needed to be turned inside out. The puddle at the base of the fountain, this puddle that was supposed to be a fountain at the base of the Columbus monument that stood in was ridiculous. It looked feeble, and it was horrible, and it kept you from the monument, and it was really stupid. And it had the name of a donor on it, which was a problem. So I proposed that we use the water and the plants to make a real island of sorts in the middle, which you could go into and be surrounded by this other stuff, which is what we then did. So, man, let me tell you, circles are terrible. They are the most bossy things to work on. Every student makes the mistake of doing a circular scheme at one time or other, and probably every professional makes the mistake of making a circular building at one time or other. They are nightmares, because the geometry drives you instead of the other way around. So this was a case of, it's okay, it's a circle, let's make it be a circle. But like a lot of landscapes, I guess one of the things if I don't get anything else across today, they ain't just trees and bushes, okay? Landscape is a noun, it's not a verb. And one of the things is that in this particular case, like most of our landscapes, they're fairly complicated things that tend to go together like a watch. And so in this case, we were over 2 subway lines, a lot of utilities with traffic all around us, trying to figure out where to put pump room, where to kind of rebuild this thing, how to get it all organized and put it back together and get the trees and everything, and then have it seem seamless, like elegant. And we finally did. It got put back together. The traffic goes around for the first time in ages, and it works real well. People actually walk across. They used the circle to cross the intersection, which no one in their right mind would have done before. It's actually a shortcut. A lot of people use it now, and you can go see it. It's really amazing. And, of course, people said, no one will go there. Well, as you can see, the design is extremely simple, yet it's been taken up by an extraordinarily diverse population at all times of the day. In good weather, of course. It's comfortable where it needs to be with big, broad, curving benches that accommodate people in all manner of positions and situations. And I've fought the city off 3 or 4 times already. We're worried that the homeless might lie down here. And I said, if you make this so the homeless can't lie down, no one else will want to be there. You'll drive the middle class out, and then it really will be a mess. You got to make people comfortable if you want to have enough people so you have a safe place. So clear. So we've carried the day so far. Well, as with so much landscape architecture, its elements are truly basic and simple. Sometimes it's kind of frustrating to us because the palette is so dumb. It's stone, it's water, it's wood, it's plants, and people want it to be more, and they wish they made trees be upside down or something more interesting. But the truth of the matter is, this good old stuff, making it fresh again and again and again, is really kind of rewarding and difficult. So here you are, while the swarming traffic is going on all around you, you're screened by very simple forms, and the central space in the middle is extremely open, which of course has to do with partly its convenience and also its safety. And likewise, the generous basins that reinforce the idea of it being an island in the sea of traffic are extremely clear and direct while answering this fundamental need that people of all sorts respond to. And as is often the case in nature, the materials are durable, the proportions of things are broad, there's a generosity. Nature is profligate and generous. And I'm always telling people, don't make it so small. My people in my office or my students will draw these funny little tiny benches. I say, make it longer, make it bigger, make it more generous. Nature is generous. Nature wastes a lot of stuff, but boy, it's wonderful. Do that in your work. So likewise, I would say, let me just check something. Yeah, no, it goes to there. This is as good a place as any to stop and say that my partners and I believe that it's our duty to design for everyone. We must not, and I really feel this so strongly, we mustn't let fear and loathing of the homeless or of any minority, any unfortunate group of our citizens, we mustn't let that on the part of others dissuade us from making welcoming places. We have to fight to keep our public realm generous and open. Now, for several months of the first summer that the project was open to the public, this woman could be found sleeping in this incomprehensible position in the morning on this coping. I could never figure out why didn't she run in the other direction with her head up, like most people do. And she'd get up about 9 a.m. and she'd depart. She didn't hurt a soul. But in Philadelphia, I'll tell you, the police would be telling her to move on. Well, I just felt great that she felt she wanted to be here. Another obvious truth that's often observed, especially by scientists and artists, is that all forms can be found in nature, and that some of them, we find, are very pleasing to us. It's therefore no accident that we went to some effort to produce this sort of sheer, sensual line of this granite coping at Columbus Circle. It's a form that was already old and quite universal when William Hogarth wrote about it in the 18th century. Just going to the trouble of making something for the sheer pleasure of the way it feels. Like our earlier experiments at Bryant Park, the design in this deceptively simple place, landscapes are always an experiment, okay, guys? They're full-size mock-ups. And one of the problems is you're never quite sure how it's all going to work until you actually get it done, and then they're never quite done. But the design of this deceptively simple place provides really good sight lines that make it safe and comfortable, even at night, when the lighting that Hervé did for us transform it into something that is even more magical than it is in the daytime. And lo and behold, has transformed it into a place that's now inhabited late in the night in good weather. To our delight, but not to our surprise. Columbus Circle has joined the family of particular and special places in New York City's landscape. It's become a place where people go to meet and just hang out. In, of all places, the middle of one of the busiest intersections in the entire city. I think this makes me feel really good. How weird to do that. And what fun. And all those people, you go there at 11 at night, 12 at night, 1 o'clock at night, there's all these young people hanging out. They never had that place to hang out before. And I don't know, it's just to them it must seem kind of goofy, and there they are. As is also obvious, I'd say in addition to the role of any particular place in the city, which you've just been talking about, just as in the architecture of buildings, and parenthetically as in nature and in natural systems, the form and the expression, or the materiality and tectonics of any given element or design affects its character and its success. Let's take the monument to the murdered Jews of Europe that we helped Peter Eisenman create in Berlin, for instance. This was a powerful project to work on and very thought-provoking, and everybody who worked on it, we were all very emotional. But one of the things about it was, one of our particular goals, mine in particular, was to give it a chilling, even dead feeling, which led to the fussing about dimensions and proportions of very few elements of their color, their texture, their surface, their weight, and density. And we boiled it down to only these two things, with a few trees that you come through along the sidewalk near the Tiergarten. So one of the things was how you make something is really, really important. And the notion that, I don't know how to say it to you more importantly, but think of it this way. A lot of things that young architects think are concepts really aren't much of a concept. For instance, take the word a cube. A cube, what does it mean? 6 sides, a bunch of lines, a bunch of corners, right? But saying a cube that has no dimension, has no weight, has no nothing, right? If I said a 6-foot cube, that's different. Now it's specific. If I said a 6-foot cube of shaving cream, that's really weird, but you can imagine it. But think how different the concept of a 6-foot cube of shaving cream is from the concept of a 6-foot cube of black granite. They're not the same concept. The materiality is enormously important in the concept, any concept you'll ever have about building and making things. I'm wandering off, but it's important. In contrast to that memorial in Berlin that we did, I'd say usually we have striven to produce in other urban projects what we usually have been trying to do. Often the purpose is completely different, namely to enhance life and to bring elements of the natural realm into close direct contact with people for their sheer exuberance and for life, for their color, their movement, their light, their texture, their seasonal change. That's this Bryant Park on the left and piece of Wagner Park, some of the gardens on the right down in Battery Park City. There are further developments, of course, that one could make once one looks at cities as a landscape. And we've tried a whole bunch on several of the many projects I've undertaken with Peter. Peter Eisenman, I've done about 24 projects in the last 20 years, and I meant to bring a book and leave it for you, or a couple of copies of the exhibition catalog from our show, our strange installation we did at the ICA in Philadelphia recently, and I'll send them to Bob. But of our many projects we've done, nearly all have remained unrealized, largely due to the deeply conservative nature of most governments and most developers. But this particular example, which I'm very fond of, is from a competition that we did for the city of Dusseldorf, Germany. It was for the construction of a large residential district. The form it took was that of ridges and valleys, even though the length, and it looks a little odd. It's different from the stuff around it, I admit. But on the other hand, the blocks are about almost exactly the same length. Buildings are the same height. We just didn't do these dreaded perimeter block stuff that the Germans have been building for 200 years. We did something else. We produced a landscape with ridges and valleys that actually had some other interesting ideas, because we could have, in alternate bands almost, we could have streets that went through running either northeast, southwest, or they could go southeast, northwest, and which we did both of in the project, and for solar reasons, but also for reasons of cold air drainage at night and that sort of thing. And then we could put conventional lanes and connecting paths running north-south, as you can see in the slide on the left. But it produced this interesting kind of trellis dendritic pattern that kind of intrigued me. But all the normal services you find in a city or in streets were there: the nursery, schools, the playgrounds, community gardens, small parks, place for the garbage truck, the mailman, all that. Everybody had an address, but it was a landscape. The whole thing was conceived that way. The buildings were basically landforms. But they also were fairly ordinary row houses. When you actually get down and look at it, they had vertical facades facing the canyons or street, and had sloping sides facing the green valleys, which then provided excellent light and outdoor terraces. Well, Peter and I we thought we'd really come up with something really good. We went to the presentation, and they hated it. They hated us. They hated the scheme. Because it wasn't normal. It just bothered them. And to me, it was a perfect demonstration of how you could produce a residential district with superb microclimate and several of the desirable qualities that we associate with going to the country and to nature. Well, that was 15 years ago. I happen to believe that today, if any of you were to propose this to somebody, they'd do it. Because I think the world is that different today than it was when we were doing these things a few years ago. I think people are ready for this sort of thing. I think the MoMA show proved that. And I think many other things have proved that. Well, in concluding, let me say something. I was reading through a book of Rem Koolhaas's a couple of years ago, and the little paperback thing I had, and it was kind of nice. And I was reading it, and in working on this plan for a new satellite town in France called Menus-Sinard, which he did several years ago with OMA, Koolhaas wrote that he and his colleagues at OMA felt that the only thing that they finally could actually design and plan and control for the government was the part that they called, mistakenly, the natural part. Namely, the open space structure, the streets, lakes, parks, and all of what we normally think of as the open space. Which in the slide, the upper slide, see there's almost like a Chinese character, the yellow strips with the blue stuff. There's two big stripes going kind of east to west, and then a curvy one, and then another one. That was the structure they believed they could produce, along with some lakes and parks. And the rest, the fabric of what we'd call the fabric of the city, he wrote that, he called that, that was where all the other buildings and most of the uses were, and he used the word wild. He said it was wild and uncontrollable. Now that's the part that most of our friends in city planning think is the one part they can control. They think, well, that's what we write the rules for. Now, Koolhaas said, no, that's the part that's absolutely wild, out of control. You can't design that or plan it. You can only plan this other bigger structure, which was basically a landscape structure. And despite his problems with language and terminology, at least in English at that period in his life, he had discovered something very important, I believe, and something that I feel and I've been sort of talking around and a little bit about tonight, and that is that the entire thing, a city, regardless of scale, is a landscape. And that the overall open space structure can and should be designed in a coherent way, and that an enormous amount of the rest is indeed a complex stew. This is the result of a million decisions and designers, of market forces, of evolving ideas and fashions, of changes in needs and issues and taste, economics. So, like my partners and I, Koolhaas had come to the conclusion that a city is a landscape too. Thank you very much. Them to suffer in the heat with questions and answers. I'm delighted to do that. What do you do normally here?
That's exactly what I was going to hope we could do. Some people have been sitting in uncomfortable positions. They might want to do something.
I'll say that I'm used to students walking out on me, so anybody who needs to go home to their babysitter, their dog, can't take the heat,